All right, welcome.
Hey. So I'm Zarin Ficklin. The topic I kind of wanted to talk about was designing for the web. So this will be, I guess, less general and less theory and a little bit more hands-on. I kind of wanted to go through the process. If we have time at the end, I'll maybe even get into Photoshop a little bit and kind of show some different things. But and then I chose web specifically. I think a lot of this translates to mobile, but I'm going to focus on kind of web applications and websites. So let's see if this will go through. Okay, so just a little background about me. I've been designing for work for maybe about 2 years. I did a little bit in high school, and before 2 years ago, I worked at a bookstore. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do career-wise. Matt approached me about doing a project, and I mentioned that I had done some design stuff in high school, but I was super rusty. But I was interested, so we worked together on a project called anotherfundate.com. It was kind of a mix between Groupon and Date Ideas. Anyways, it didn't go anywhere, but it kind of got my foot in the door into designing again. And so I got really into it. I looked up tutorials online and spent 4 or 5 hours each day after work just kind of tinkering and playing and trying to design things. And eventually I was approached by a company called Scan. They're based out of Provo. They're a QR code reading app, but they have over 15 million downloads, and they got funding from Google, $1.7 million. So anyways, I worked for them as a front-end developer for a little while, until I got to the point where I kind of wanted to do my own things. I was working with Matt more, and so I went freelance for a long time, probably a year to a year and a half, and kind of did a mix of that and projects with Matt. And then recently, we decided to kind of consolidate all of our side projects and just work together under one umbrella name of HQ. So that's what I do right now. HQ is just a small design and development company. We have 7 employees. A few of those are on contract basis, but we do mostly front end and user interface design, a little bit of back end too. So that's my background. I guess
Zarin, which department are you in right now?
Computer science.
Okay.
Yep. So anyway, yeah, if there's any comments or questions, feel free to input. I don't want this to just be a long monologue. So anyways, just a little bit about the industry, I guess. The industry is great, I guess, is a simple way to put it. If you're interested, there's a really good article by Fast Co. If you just Google this, why good design is finally a bottom line investment, it's really interesting. He talks a lot about, a lot of times we think about design in terms of making things look good, but this article specifies how it actually helps businesses make more money and be more effective, which I think is pretty cool. One quote that I like from that talks about how Silicon Valley is currently engaged in an all-out talent war over designers. So right now there's a lot of demand for design, but not a lot of talented user interface designers. Because of that, there's a lot of opportunities. The pay is good, and like it talks about here in Silicon Valley, where most of kind of these tech startups are coming from, they can't find enough designers. So I use this kind of to encourage people that are thinking about design as a career path. Right now it's great. So actually we can talk about this. This is some examples of some design first startups that have come out of Silicon Valley recently, where they don't have good design because they're a big company, but they're a big company because their design is good, and they kind of started with a design first approach. Instagram is a great example. Recently bought for $1 billion, which is more than New York Times is worth, which is pretty crazy for just a simple photo sharing app. And a reason Instagram is so successful is because of their design. There's tons of photo sharing apps out there, but Instagram won on the design. We're talking about user experience too, so another thing that's kind of interesting with Instagram versus other photo sharing apps is if you haven't used Instagram, you take a photo and then you choose a filter if you want and put a caption. And what they did is they had the photo loading while you selected the filter and put in your caption, so that by the time you're done selecting that, your photo is instantly there. Whereas the other competitors, you take a photo and then you have to wait like 2 minutes to upload it. and so a lot of people got frustrated with that. So user experience is another reason that they've succeeded where other people haven't, and they were bought for $1 billion. So good success story. Some of these other companies are good design-first companies where the founders really focus on design from the ground up. Another quote from that article, the success of Pinterest and Microsoft both hinge upon how well they intuit what users want. Microsoft, I think, is another good example. They haven't always been known for their design, but with this recent kind of update, they've been focusing a lot more on design. I think that's helping them be competitive in this space. Here's just a chart. I just Googled average salary for designers. I don't know how accurate this is, but those numbers are pretty good. I was curious kind of what the industry was like in Utah when I was getting started. So I found who was kind of considered the best user interface designer in Utah, and I just emailed him and asked him how much he charged, and he charged $120 per hour, and he's freelance. So, there's lots of people that charge a lot more than that. So, from a freelance perspective, it's great. If you want to join a startup, it's also fantastic because startups are scrambling to find user interface designers to kind of be a part of their team. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Quora.com. It's kind of a question and answer site where people that answer kind of verify, they kind of show why they're credible, I guess. One of the questions on there that I thought was interesting was, what would the ideal web technology startup team be composed of? The top voted answer, this one had 297 votes. Hacker, hustler, designer. Hacker and hustler are just kind of, I guess, lingo for a developer and a business guy. So kind of the trifecta of designer, developer, and kind of business guy. And all the other answers that were voted very highly all included designers, which I thought was interesting because if you would have asked this question even 5 years ago, I think a lot of people wouldn't have mentioned designer as a co-founder position that's really critical. So it just kind of shows the direction that the industry is going right now. Okay, so from our perspective with HQ, one of the biggest challenges of finding good designers is finding user interface designers versus print designers. There's a lot of very talented print designers out there. I think our program at Weber State pumps out a ton of very talented print designers. User interface, it's a lot more challenging to find people that are good at this. Here's an example of some great designs for print that don't necessarily translate to a user interface. So that's been huge, trying to train people to rethink for the web or for mobile. Here's some examples of user interface versus print. They look great, but it's considerably different from those previous screenshots because you're not designing just to make something look good. You're designing to make something usable, which is much more challenging in a lot of instances. Some other keywords, I guess, just to talk about real quick. The difference between user interface and user experience. You kind of hear these thrown around a lot. If you're looking to hire people, a lot of times they'll say, I'm a user interface designer or I'm a user experience designer. What's the difference? What do they mean? I like the way that this was put. UX, or user experience design, deals with the overall experience associated with the use of a product or service. So it's a lot more enveloping, I guess. Whereas user interface design deals with specific user interfaces or elements. So the buttons, the layout, and so forth. So UI design will be heavily informed by the UX, whereas UX design will be less informed by the UI. So user experience is more overarching. It's the entire experience of the product, whereas a user interface designer just kind of designs the elements on the screen. Here's kind of an infographic somebody made that kind of helped me understand the difference better. So right there, that first screen is the product. You have all the different elements laid out. User experience is the cereal in the bowl. So it's the experience of taking the cereal out of the bowl with the spoon, it's having it inside of the bowl, and so forth. UI, they use the spoon, so in a lot of cases, user interface is just the tool that helps you experience the whole thing. Then they also had the server, and down below is a data center that had a bunch of cereal boxes, so I thought it was a cool infographic. All right, so I just kind of wanted to cover some user interface basics for the web specifically. Some of these are a little more broad, some are more specific, but these are kind of some basics that don't necessarily translate to print, but more specifically towards web or mobile or whatever. This one is probably the broadest, spacing. This is the biggest problem with any website that's not working, is the spacing. How elements are laid out, how close they are, how they're lined up. This will fix 99% of the design problems you see. This is a good example, I think, of spacing things. Since it's a screenshot, it's not the best to illustrate, but if you saw the whole screen, there's equal spacing on the side as there is there and there. There's equal spacing here between all of those, and if you look at the rows, there's equal spacing there, and so forth. A lot of the better designed websites look good because they're spaced correctly. Here's a tweet that I like. This is one of the better designers in Utah. He tweeted, "As an interface designer, there's a solid chance you'll spend 63.3% of your time holding down Shift while tapping on your arrow keys." Shift is just kind of a shortcut to nudge an element in Photoshop 10 pixels. And that's so true. I feel like 50% of my time is just staring at the screen and moving something just a little bit. And then I stare at it some more and move it a little bit more. So spacing is huge. I think Windows or Microsoft's new kind of Metro style is a good example of that too. Not everyone's the biggest fan, but I think that it looks really good, and I'm impressed with their kind of whole redesign. And a lot of that is just how elements are spaced between each other. Okay, white space is another big one. Talk about Microsoft. Apple is the other example. I think they do really good with white space. If you look at all of their specific product pages, they use a lot of white space, and I think a lot of designers are really afraid of using that much white space to start out with. And it really, it draws your eyes to the product, draws your eyes to the words. It's clean, it's not cluttered, so that's really effective with web. Clean and simple. This is another challenge that you see with a lot of websites, is that they try to put too much on there, and it just hinders the design instead of helping it. A good example of this is Square.com. They have a beautiful design, and they're kind of a startup that's focused on designing first. Actually, the co-founder of Square is the co-founder of Twitter, so I think he took a lot of lessons learned from Twitter and translated that to Square. As you can see, they don't have a lot of clutter on the site. They have their kind of phrase, a screenshot, a couple navigation items, and that's it. That's their whole homepage. I think it's very effective. Goal-oriented design. This is something that Matt talked about last week that's really important. From a designer's point of view, it can be really tempting to try and make your designs look as cool as you can, make them really flashy, and make people look at your site and think, oh, he's such a great designer, look at these cool things he did. But really, that shouldn't be your focus at all. All of your focus on a design should be accomplishing the goals of the website, whether that's increasing traffic, getting signups, increasing conversions, whatever that might be. An example of that, there's this site. It looks cool, but it's hard to navigate. I went on it, and it has these weird animations, and it's hard to figure out where I'm going and what I'm supposed to do. Even though it looks cool, I'm sure the designer thought, oh, this is so awesome, and the client thought, like, wow, this looks really cool. Okay, another good thing, choose good fonts. This is huge too. From a designer's point of view, it's challenging to kind of figure out how to find good web fonts that work on the web. As a print designer, there's tons of fonts, but they don't all necessarily work on the web. And of all the options that you have for default fonts, there aren't very many that are good. Just changing your font to something that looks nice can make a huge difference on how your entire website looks. Here's a couple resources, I guess. Go ahead, yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit on how the context of print medium versus the online medium affects fonts?
Sure, yeah. So in order to use a font on a website, you have to have the web font versions, and different browsers require different font types. And so a lot of print designers have one version of their font, and they try and use that on the web, and they don't have the right versions of that font, and so it doesn't display like it would on print. There's a lot of readability things too with print fonts versus web fonts. So yeah, those are some of the bigger challenges. And also layout. You can do a lot of really cool things with typography that's more challenging to do online, as far as tilting it or mixing it with other fonts. Whereas if you want that to translate from print to web, a lot of times you just have to make an image, which doesn't help you with search engine optimization. So it can be challenging.
So I mean, like, sans serif versus serif fonts. Is one more readable in one context than another?
They're both used. I mean, there's different opinions on which are better, but you can see examples of both on great websites. So I don't have an opinion whether one is better than the other. A lot of times
in the literature, I mean, like when you go down the highway, I didn't notice those till last year. And it's like when you're reading traffic signs, they're all sans serif. And my inference was, oh, well, sans serif is more readable. That's probably why they do it. But I think I made not having made any formal study of this, I thought, well, maybe it's the same way on the web. That people are, you're not sitting down with a book. You're trying to capture people's interest quickly and make the page readable. So you'd use a sans serif font, which I don't know if I'm right on this or not. But at least there's a predominance of using more sans serif on the web.
Yeah. Do you have a comment? Go ahead.
I was going to say, in a couple of weeks, one of the things when we talk about my eye tracking study, I did a small study about typography on the web, and I can show that. I'll have to look back at it. It's been a while. I can't even hardly remember to find it.
They've done research. Yeah, I was going to say, I can talk about, because I just recently did a Lindy tutorial about typography. So traditionally, sans serif has just been used as typography on the web because resolutions aren't very good and their fonts don't render the same in each of the browsers. Right, and so especially when you use serif fonts, sometimes the little serifs, they can blend together, which makes the font really hard to read. And so, your kerning is important to get right, especially when using a serif font. Now, if you're using a bigger serif font, it's less of an issue because it's a lot easier to read, but it's the small type.
It's kind of opposite in print. The serif typography works better on print. Like if you look at most books, they are printing the small type in serif type because we identify words by shapes and not, and all that. We don't really see all of the letters one by one, and so it gives us more visual cues.
Although I do think you're seeing more sans serif for even magazine articles
but they have to
and
kern in
now,
different spaces a little bit differently for readability.
I saw research that said you read most easily what you're familiar with as well. And so part of it is also just choices. The modernist movement decided sans serif was the way to go, and so we've seen it time and time
and now our monitors have much better resolution.
Yeah.
So the context depends as well.
Yeah, and with Retina displays, it could get to where sans serif is really easy to read. But I think either option is fine. I guess is a short answer for now. These are some resources if you're looking for good web fonts. Google Web Fonts is great because they give you the code. They give you every version of the font type that you need, so it works in every browser. They have a lot of really good ones. They've spent a lot of time on that recently. LostType.com is great. You can pay any amount, so if you're on a low budget, then that's great. TypeKit is awesome too. It's a paid service. You pay $50 a year, but they have a lot of very expensive fonts that render on the web that you can hook them to your site. So.
Font Squirrel is
great too, yeah. So,
they have both web and print.
yeah, they're great. If you're using Google Web Fonts, I recommend this site, hellohappy.org/beautifulwebtype. They show examples of the Google Web Fonts, kind of in a web format, so you can see what it's actually going to look like, and they kind of pick some of the better ones. So hellohappy.org/beautiful-web-type. Okay, here's another thing kind of worth mentioning. Subtle layer styles. For those that aren't familiar, layer style is it's kind of a phrase from Photoshop. It's where you're adding kind of these little lines. You can see the highlight lines, the subtle drop shadows, the inner shadows. If you look at these examples, they're all very, very subtle. That highlight line isn't much brighter than the rest of the button. That inner shadow doesn't go down very deep. And they don't set a very high opacity on that. Some of this is kind of technical, I guess, but this is something I see a lot from newer interface designers is they set these layer styles very, very vividly. So they set a very high opacity, make them very big to kind of make it stand out, and it doesn't work as well overall. Here's some examples of that. I think I blame Word for a lot of those Word text, Word art things that they have. A lot of designers trying to make like, ooh, let's make it really shiny. And, whereas, does this go back? Nope. Okay. Oh, that's right. Whereas if you compare that to this page again, it's very, very subtle, but it's effective. Okay. Here's another huge thing that I see all the time. I swear, like every client I've ever had, I send them the mock-up. The first feedback is, make the logo bigger. And I tell them, like, look at any big website. The logos are always very small. With print, maybe having a bigger logo is more important, but on the web, it's not.
Not really like business cards.
Yeah, I mean, your logo honestly doesn't matter. You're not there to have them look at your logo. They're there on the website to do whatever the goal is. So we don't want to distract them with this gigantic logo. If they're on their site, if they're on your site, they already know what it is because they typed in the URL. So yeah, Facebook, they just did their new redesign with the graph search, and they used to have the Facebook logo, and now it's just an F, and it's tiny. People know that they're on Facebook, so they don't need a logo. Okay.
Hey, Zarin? Just talking about logos, currently Weber State University is reviewing its logo, and John Kowalewski, who's at the University of Communications, he's been talking to me about the color of our purple and the space. He was showing this to me, and I'm saying to myself, this doesn't matter to me one bit, but go ahead. Just the spacing between W and E and the shield and what it looks like. And I guess our color purple doesn't print well, or it doesn't print consistently, either on hard copy or on the internet. So there's this big movement now that John is spearheading to change the logo, and so that's going to be coming out real soon.
Cool. Yeah, I'm excited for that.
So I was wondering, he should be talking to some people here rather than me about it. But,
yeah. We'd be cool to present here too, I'm sure.
So
are we going to change the purple? Are we going to be a different color purple now?
Boy, they're so picky about that purple. You gotta use it.
Okay.
Oh, you guys do.
The darker one, yeah.
Obviously a point of some contention.
All right, so next one. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. This is, I hate to bash on print designers. That's not what I'm trying to do, but this is another problem that we see a lot is print designers do really awesome things with posters and brochures and whatnot that don't translate to the web as well. And a lot of designers try and do these crazy things that aren't effective. It'll make your website look cool and stand out, but it's not going to help you accomplish the website's goal in most cases. I mean, there are exceptions, but for the most part, you don't need to go crazy. This one, if you have a browser open, this is worth looking at, snowbird.com. They do a lot of cool things with animations that are kind of newer, that I don't see on a lot of websites. So they kind of have more of an innovative website, especially if you like scroll over this, they have this cool animation that folds over, or if you scroll over the navigation tabs, they actually have a mountain landscape that like comes up as you scroll over. It's really cool. Snowbird.com is actually designed by the guy that I showed his tweet earlier about nudging stuff. But anyways, it's innovative, but at the same time, he's not reinventing the wheel. The navigation is still in the familiar spot. The logo is in the top left. People can come to here and they automatically know how to navigate the site. So yeah, that's a big one. Let's see if, okay, there we go. Another principle, don't hold, did I type that wrong? Don't use design elements for the sake of having them. This can be tempting as a designer. Like, I think like, oh, if I have this pagination, then my site is going to look cool, or breadcrumbs. They have their purposes, but you don't necessarily need them on every site. And some designers think, well, the last site I had breadcrumbs. Let's add it to this one, but you really don't need it. Social, I think, is a huge example of that. It seems like every designer thinks I have to have social on this website, but you really don't. A lot of sites don't need that. Or they have it, and they're not using their social media at all, so it leads to a Twitter account that hasn't been used in 6 months. And really, that's just hurting them more than helping them. Twitter feed is another big one. Some companies will add a Twitter feed, so it automatically shows the tweets that they have, and their tweets aren't relevant to what their website's viewers want. So that's something to keep in mind from a web designer's point of view is don't feel like you need to use elements just because you can. Think about how they help the website and how they help the goals of the website.
Another, I mean, you use your nomenclature, your distinctions in the beginning with it, because they don't have your UX driven by your UI.
What was that, sorry?
Don't have your UX informed by your
Yeah,
UI.
yeah, exactly. No, that's a perfect example. And a lot of, I mean, that's kind of a pitfall of a lot of designers, is they focus more on making it look good rather than accomplishing the goals, and that happens over and over and over. It's a great point. This one's important. Consolidate whenever possible. I'm going to use Square again as an example. Square.com has plenty of pages. They have more than 3 pages, but if you look at their navigation, they have their logo, Square Register, Square Wallet, sign in. That's it. It's so tempting to think like, oh, we have a blog. Let's put that on the navigation. We have an about page. We have a terms page. And so these navigations get so bloated that they're not even helpful anymore because you can't find the important things among all the links that aren't as important. So you can't see it here. Oh, you can kind of see it, but they have their footer with all the less important links. Another thing is a lot of sites think they have to have separate pages for everything. So when you can consolidate pages into one, that helps a lot too. For example, like if you have frequently asked questions and there's only 3, just combine that with your contact page and call it support. So anyway, Square.com is awesome. Avoid lorem ipsum. If you're not familiar, lorem ipsum is kind of a Latin filler text. So if you have a block of text in a website mockup, you can paste lorem ipsum so it just looks like there's text there. But it seems like every time I do that, the client replies like, why is there Latin on my website? And it actually detracts from the design because they're so focused on like, what does that say? Even if you copy from like a Wikipedia article, your eye glosses over that a lot easier than lorem ipsum. But if you can make your filler text and mockups as relevant as possible, it really helps the design process. Oh, here's an example of what, you can't read it I guess, but that's what lorem ipsum looks like. There's a font called Block, B-L-O-K-K, that actually shows, you type it in Photoshop or whatever, and it just creates these lines of text. So if you're making smaller mockups, it's really good. Anyways, if you're interested in that, B-L-O-K-K, you can just Google it and you'll find it. Here's another big one, large tapping areas. So nowadays, 30% or more of people are browsing the internet on mobile. So you want all of your links now to be large tappable areas, which means we avoid just simple text links wherever possible. That's not always possible, but for your important links at least, you want the tapping area to be big. 44 pixels at least is kind of the rule of thumb. Here's just some examples. If you notice, all of these buttons are they're bigger. You have a bigger area to tap. So I guess the biggest area to kind of translate this to is with navigations. That's kind of the most important thing of your website, or calls to action. So if you have like sign up or whatever, you want that to be an area that you can tap on mobile. And with responsive design, which I'm sure will be talked about later, you can make it so where it's not as big on web, but when it translates to mobile, the links get bigger. So that's something to kind of keep in mind while you're designing. Trends. This is kind of an interesting topic. Designers hate to think that they're following trends, but we have to kind of. It's not necessarily always a bad thing. As long as you're using trends not for the sake of making your website look trendy, but to kind of help the design. And the web moves fast. What looks good a year ago doesn't necessarily look good now. And so it is kind of important to be in mind of those trends and kind of stay up so that your website looks modern. Because, I mean, a big part of having a website is to add credibility to your product, your company, and if your website looks outdated, that detracts from your credibility in a lot of cases. So here are a couple of trends that are kind of bigger right now. Blurred photo backgrounds. If you look at a lot of sites, they use kind of a blurred background photo behind their main content. That's really big right now. Another one, well, this is kind of a trend that's going away and a new trend that's coming in. Skeuomorphic versus flat. Skeuomorphic is just a fancy word for designing things that look like real life things. So like the fake leather or kind of embossed look. So a website looks like it's made out of paper or whatever. Versus flat, that Microsoft's kind of leading the trend on this, where we're going away from these layer styles and drop shadows and realistic looking elements to more of this flat design. So this top one is an example of skeuomorphic. They have this kind of ribbon with the stitching, so it looks like something in real life. We have drop shadows here, so it looks like things are kind of pressed out. I'm not a big fan of this one anymore, whereas a year and a half ago it's like, oh, this is cool. This is kind of a more modern example of skeuomorphic design, more subtle, which I think still looks great. They have kind of very subtle drop shadows, some 1 pixel highlights here kind of on the bottom, so it looks like it's pressed up a little bit, but not very much. And then on the bottom we have kind of some examples of the flat trend that Microsoft is kind of leading with Windows 8 and Windows Metro and so forth. And props to them because it's working, because a lot of bigger companies and bigger sites are kind of moving towards this this trend, which is cool. So another trend, screenshots and devices. I don't know how much of a trend this is. It's something that's probably going to stick around a lot, but a lot of websites now will show the product in a mobile device. Even if their product isn't an app, but they show their product to say like, hey, this works on mobile. That's really big right now. It's easy to spend a lot of time trying to get your screenshot to look really good in a device, so there's some resources that kind of make that easy. This is an awesome one. I just found it like a week ago. Placeit.breezy.com with an I. Definitely check this one out. Basically what they do is they provide kind of professional grade photography of somebody holding a device, whether it's an iPad or a Nexus or a laptop or whatever, and you upload your screenshot and it puts it in there. So this is an example that we use with one of our products. We just have the screenshot, you upload it in, and boom, it looks like we took this cool picture of somebody holding an iPad, but we really didn't. It only takes a couple of seconds. There's also, oh, go ahead. Placeit.breezy.com. Let me go back. Yeah. You can also download, there's a lot of PSDs that you can get for templates for different devices. So anyway, okay, so those are kind of some of the trends. How much time do we have left? Like 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I was learning design, I was very curious about the process of how these other designers did things. There's no right or wrong process, but I think it's really helpful, I guess, just to see designers' process of how they do things. A lot of times you can pick up things that you never thought of before, and you're like, oh, that's a lot easier than the way I was doing it. So I just kind of want to go over the process that I use for designing interfaces. Some of the things might not be the most effective, but maybe it'll provide something helpful. Okay, so typically, clients always ask, like, how does this work? What's the design process for you? This is what I tell them usually. There's these 4 steps. This differs between different designers, but the first step is planning, then wireframing, then kind of a more high fidelity design, and then iterating. So planning, a lot of this involves what Matt talked about last week. The biggest one is determining the goals. So it's funny how many clients don't know what their goal is of making a website. They just know that they need one. So this is good to kind of focus with them and decide, what do we want this website or this application to accomplish? And all the design is centered on that goal. Another big thing is cutting to the core of the product. A lot of startups or businesses have this cool product and they have all these different features, but they can't explain it to anyone in a sentence or two. They have to like pull it out and show them, like, here's this feature and it does this and it does this. But you need to be able to explain it in a sentence, or in the case of web, in just one screenshot. They need to come to the website and immediately know, what is this, what does it do, how is it going to help me? So that's huge. Another thing to plan is information architecture. So we have all these different elements, all these different messages, all these different goals. Information architecture is deciding which ones get priority. So for example, if we're going to have a call to action, we want that to have highest priority. So that's going to go at the top of the website. And then we'll talk about the features, and then we'll go more in depth on this feature, and so forth. So a lot of that is just determining what's most important and where it's going to appear on the priority chart. Responsive planning, this is a big one. And this is something I'm sure we'll talk about more in depth in future classes, but to make a website responsive, you basically have to start over and build it from the ground up. It's very, very challenging to adapt an already made website and make it responsive. So that happens here in this kind of planning phase. A lot of times we'll sketch out what's going to appear on mobile, what's going to appear on tablet, and then what's going to appear on desktop. Something we've kind of decided very recently that's effective is to actually design for phone first, and then move up to tablet, and then to desktop. So that's important. And then in this planning stage, I'll usually do some rough sketches. And this varies from designer to designer, but I prefer to kind of start just on a notepad and just roughly sketch out how things are going to be laid out. I guess I should have brought mine, but anyway. Next step is wireframing. Wireframing is just kind of creating the basic layout without getting detailed as far as color schemes or fonts, things like that. This is something that also varies a lot between designers, how they wireframe. There's some tools out there that let you do it even if you're not a designer, like Balsamic is one. There's a couple other ones that are free that kind of let you at least figure out how things are laid out and what screen goes to what screen. I kind of prefer to do it in Photoshop just because I'm more familiar with Photoshop than these third-party wireframing tools. And it kind of allows, like I mentioned, it allows me to test out the fonts and layouts better. And for me, it's quicker to adapt to the high fidelity design. So I'll actually get in Photoshop and kind of show you an example. Let's see here. Okay, so this is a wireframe for a client. It's pretty basic, as you can tell. It's essentially monotone. I just kind of wanted to get the layout with him first. I guess it's kind of hard to see on that bright screen. But I sent this to him. He okayed the layout, and I was able to make changes very quickly without having to redo a ton of stuff. And something like this doesn't really take that long. It's mostly just simple lines. And I prefer to do it in Photoshop because I can test the fonts. So I was able to quickly go through the fonts and see what they actually look like. A lot of the wireframing tools use terrible fonts, and it just ruins the whole layout in my opinion. So for me, I like this just because they can visualize what it's going to look like better. And also, when I'm ready to adapt this to the high fidelity, I already have all the layers here organized, and it's just a matter of adding texture, adding colors, but I can use the same design here instead of starting from scratch again. So anyways, let me go back to the slide. What's the quote about great artist still? How's it go? Good artist something.
Yeah, I think it's from Picasso.
Good artist copy, great artist steal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, when they think about designers, even artists, they think like you start with this white canvas and then your website just appears out of nowhere. And it's not like that at all. It's surprising how much of a process it actually is. My mom is actually a professional artist, and it's the same thing with her. People think she just has this white canvas and then her mind goes crazy and all of a sudden she's inspired and creates this thing. But that's not the case with her. There's a process of where you're kind of lightly sketching the circles, drawing the layout, and you fill it in as you go. The same thing goes with inspiration. It's not like every site that I make, I'm inspired with this new, innovative design. Most top designers, a lot of their designs look very similar actually, and a lot of that is kind of based on trends. So when I'm designing a new site, I'll typically open 10 examples of sites that I like that I kind of want to emulate. A great resource for that is dribble.com. In fact, this is the best resource that I could possibly think of for interface design. It's dribble with 3bs.com. That site is awesome. I also, whenever I find a site that I like, I'll save it in bookmark folders. I have like 13 bookmark folders with like 20 sites each. It kind of gets out of hand, but so typically when I'm starting a new site and figuring out the layout or the style I want to get, I'll open up 10 or 20 of those, and I'll pick and choose different elements from each that I like and kind of combine that into the design that I'm making. With Photoshop, so a typical browser width for the web is 960 is where you want your content to go in. That's slowly increasing. A lot of designers are moving more to 1,000 pixels. But I'll create kind of guidelines. I can show you here actually.
Do you use a grid system when you do that?
Very loosely. So like if you look at this, those are the only guidelines I use. So when I start a new project, I'll create a new document, make the width 960 and the height, whatever, like 1440 is fine. And I'll create these 3 guidelines. These are really the only ones that I need. Oops. One in the center, so I can keep things centered, and one there. And then from there, I'll make the width 1440. So I know everything in this space right here is where all my content needs to go, but I can kind of visualize what it'll look like on a bigger monitor. And sometimes I'll use more guidelines for like the header or the footer, but I don't know. I don't necessarily have to have those. So anyways, that's kind of the wireframing process. And then high fidelity, just I guess the end product is what we're going for here. A lot of these things I talked about. I guess I can just show you a couple tools that I use to keep things organized. Let's see here. So here's a project I've been working on more recently. So yeah, I don't have very many guidelines here either. I'll make them and then I'll take them away once things are lined up. But anyways, this is just my preference. I like to keep all of these organized in folders so that I can reveal and hide things really quickly. And that way, if the developer can navigate my Photoshop file very easily. So I'll keep things in very specific folders, name things exactly what they are so that if somebody else is using this, they can know what it is. Anyways, that's a tool. I had another tool on this list. Oh, where are we at? Okay, CSS3PS. This is a Photoshop plugin. I highly recommend this for anyone that does design and development. Essentially what it does is it's a plugin you install. I guess I don't have it here, so I can't really show you. But for example, like this button right here. Oh, wrong hotkey. How do I select that? Okay, so we have this button right here. If you look closely, there's a lot of layer styles. It kind of has like a highlight up top. There's this inner shadow, a gradient. With CSS3PS, you click on the plugin button, and it will take all those layer styles and create the code for it. So, really cool tool. Makes development a lot faster.
It creates just CSS code.
Yeah, it's pure CSS3, so it's great.
Awesome.
And it also makes your sites faster because you don't have to use images, you can use just pure code.
Right.
So, highly recommend that. Styles tab. So, for example, there's a lot of, like, if you notice on this text, there's a subtle drop shadow, and I use that one a lot. So, Photoshop has a bunch of default styles that are terrible, like these. But if you make one that you use a lot, oh, maybe this version doesn't have it. Oh, let me go in here, actually. If you design one that has a lot of things that you have to switch the sliders back and forth a lot, you can just create a new style. And that way you can rapidly create buttons and elements, and it doesn't take you 10 years. So those are, I guess the overall toolkit for design is a lot simpler than development. Those are the basic ones I use. Aside from Photoshop and a notepad, there really isn't a whole lot that you need, which is great because if somebody is interested in starting up learning design, they can do it very easily. You can download a trial version of Photoshop and spend 30 days using it, and then you can wipe your computer and then download it again, or you can get a the student version for a lot cheaper.
So what about Illustrator?
So, good question.
For InDesign.
Yeah.
Illustrator.
At least
I like Illustrator.
from those I've talked to, InDesign isn't used at all for web.
You can export the web.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily the most effective, but I'm opinionated, so I don't know. I've used Photoshop for like the last 15 years of my life, so anything that I know is more effective in Illustrator, I can do it faster in Photoshop, so I haven't spent a lot of time.
Well, you can't really export to the web in Illustrator.
Well, and the
But you
big
can
difference.
design it.
The big difference is that Illustrator is vector, whereas pixels and raster, which Photoshop is,
Well, sure.
makes more sense
I
for
know
web.
that, but
So
it's
I'll paste
object-based,
stuff
you can
in.
move
Yeah.
things around a lot easier.
A lot of it is just based on opinion and what you know. There's a lot of great designers that use only Illustrator, a lot that use only Fireworks, and a big reason for that is that's what they're familiar with, so that's what they're fastest in. A big majority though does use Photoshop, and in my opinion it's the best, but that's my opinion. So that's what I would recommend to anyone.
Illustrator's a lot better for actual, like what it says, illustrations.
Yeah.
So when you're actually like creating things like logos or images, you're making animations, that seems like Illustrator's a lot better for that.
So you're actually creating the artwork.
Yeah, but whereas Photoshop, you know, everything he showed, I think it's a lot better. The design and the layout.
If you had to choose one, I mean, so many images are actually photos on the web,
Yeah.
and then you really need Photoshop to size.
Yeah. In my opinion, none are like perfectly ideal for web. I think that there's a space available for somebody to make something that works better for web. A lot of flows are kind of not the most efficient, but anyway, that's what I use. So yeah, beyond this step, there's the iterate step. A lot of reiterations are based on time, because something that you looked at now might not look good later. You'll think of something later, and that's something that you can't really rush. And then we'll iterate based on client feedback and then based on testing. So kind of what Matt talked about last week. A design element that might look cool might not be the most effective for your goal, so you'll change the design based on that. So that's my basic process. Like I've kind of mentioned, I would definitely recommend this industry or a career path to anyone. I think there's a ton of demand, the pay is great. The learning curve can be big, but the nice thing is you can learn it all on your own if you want to. So anyways, that's my presentation. Any questions?
Will you add this to our Canvas site?
What was that?
Will you add this to our Canvas site?
Oh, sure. Yep.
What does Dribble do again? I went to the
So,
site and I can't understand.
Dribble is basically a design community. So
Yeah.
it's an invite-only designer community, so you have to be invited from somebody else. And they basically just post works in progress and screenshots of what they're working on. And it's very organized by tag. So if you're looking for like a button, for example, or a certain element, you want to see different designers' take on that. It's really good for inspiration. So actually, for client work, it's great too. It seems like recently, like 40 or 50% of our client work has come through Dribble. So it's two things, I guess: a community to kind of get inspiration and feedback from other designers, and two, kind of a pseudo portfolio site, I guess.
The works are proprietary, though. I mean, the copyrighted.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think we could do the, maybe screenshots of what you had up in Photoshop?
Yeah. Sure.
Or just put the Photoshop file
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay.
How
Okay.
long does this process take you?
Really hard to say. I mean, obviously it depends on the project. For let's say like a billboard style website where we have kind of the front facing public landing page, and you have an about page and a contact page and a terms page, maybe we would say like 10 to 20 hours of design. And a lot of that is process. It's not that I'm going to be in Photoshop for 20 hours. It's the entire process. So it depends, but.
What are the perils of moving from, low prototype wireframing directly to just building a web page without going through Photoshop?
Good question. I think a lot of people spend way too much time on wireframing. A lot of projects, I will sometimes even skip it or just do it on paper. For bigger projects, though, it's important because there's a lot of iteration that goes back and forth on the layout before you even start designing. So in that sense, it saves you time. But I think if it gets to the point where it's not saving you time, don't do it. That's kind of why I like to do it in Photoshop, because I can use the exact same layout, the same layers and everything for my whole design, whereas if you have to start over, that can be a big time sink. But a lot of clients like it too, so there's some where you kind of have to bite the bullet and take that step, but if that's in your bid, then they're paying for it anyway, so.
What do you use to make that last leap? So you've done all the design in Photoshop, and then when you move it into,
Yeah,
web
good
design,
question.
or what do you use?
So you can slice it all in Photoshop. There's a couple quick tricks where you can isolate things really quick. I can just show you two of them. So for example, if I want to isolate this logo, I can click on that. Oh, maybe the
Control click.
Yeah, the shortcuts are different than what I'm
Yeah.
used to. Okay. Oh, it's still not working. That's weird. That's all right.
You have to, there's a button you have to click up top that lets you select a layer.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's what I need.
That happens to me all the time.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that drives me crazy.
Let's see if we can get that. There we go. Okay, so we have the logo here. If you hold, let's see if it works in Windows, Alt, and then click on it, it hides everything else, and then you can go to Image, Trim, and then you just save that. And then you undo it, and click on that, and that's it. Whereas if you have like a texture that we want to copy, like for example this header, we just select that, copy it, do a new window, and it's automatic. Oh, maybe it's, let's copy this way. Okay. Do a new window, and it. Oh, that's weird. Oh.
It's supposed
Shift,
Control Shift. Yeah, there we go. I hate going back and forth. If you do a new window, it'll automatically be the size of that selection. Then you paste it and save that. So that process really doesn't take that long, and then you have all those images and you can code it out.
And then what do you use for your?
I use Coda 2 is the name of the text editor I use, but there's lots of great options. Sublime is a good free one. Or you can use something more complex like Eclipse or NetBeans or whatever, but I like Coda.
Do you typically code your own sites?
Yeah.
Or do you pass it off a lot?
Yeah, I used to do all of that, but I've been transitioning to do more design, less of that. But yeah, I like it sometimes. I think it's fun to kind of design something in Photoshop, and then in the code you actually see it come to life, which is really fun. The part I hate is where there's bugs or lining things up, and it just takes so much time. That's a pain, but I like the first process at least. Okay, cool.
Cool, Zarin, thanks.
Okay,
This is great.
no problem.
Nice job.